Control rarely introduces itself as control. It almost always arrives wearing the face of necessity. It begins with a sentence that sounds responsible, practical, or protective, and because the intention appears reasonable, few people notice what quietly changed underneath it. The first change is not in behavior, but in perception. A mind that begins organizing reality around survival slowly loses the ability to imagine reality organized around trust. This is why fear alone is not the defining quality of this consciousness. Every human being experiences fear. Fear can awaken wisdom just as easily as panic. What distinguishes this pattern is what happens after fear appears. Instead of allowing fear to pass through awareness, it begins constructing a permanent architecture around it. Temporary danger becomes permanent expectation. A single experience becomes an entire worldview. Once that architecture is established, everything entering awareness must pass through it. Every stranger becomes a potential threat before becoming a person. Every disagreement becomes a challenge to authority before becoming a conversation. Every uncertainty becomes something that must be dominated before it can be understood. The world has not actually become more dangerous. The lens through which it is interpreted has simply narrowed until danger appears everywhere. Because of this, control begins feeling compassionate from inside its own perspective. The parent who cannot allow a child to make mistakes calls it love. The leader who refuses to share responsibility calls it stability. The institution that monitors every action calls it safety. The individual who attempts to control every relationship calls it loyalty. None of these people necessarily wake each morning intending harm. Many genuinely believe they are protecting what matters most. This is one reason this pattern survives for generations. If domination always felt cruel, very few would participate willingly. Instead, it often feels responsible. It feels disciplined. It feels mature. It even feels morally superior because uncertainty has become associated with weakness while control has become associated with virtue. Without noticing, the person begins worshiping predictability more than truth. Notice what happens inside your own body when something unexpected interrupts your plans. The interruption itself lasts only a moment. What follows is more revealing than the event itself. Does awareness become curious, or does it immediately begin searching for someone to blame? Does your attention expand to include new information, or does it contract toward restoring control as quickly as possible? Those few seconds often reveal far more about consciousness than the event that triggered them. The deeper this architecture grows, the less reality is allowed to surprise it. Every new experience must fit existing expectations because uncertainty has become emotionally intolerable. Information that confirms existing beliefs is welcomed immediately. Information that threatens identity is questioned before it is even examined. Eventually, intelligence becomes employed not for discovery but for defense. Brilliant minds can become prisoners of conclusions they no longer realize they are protecting. This is why domination and intelligence are not opposites. In many cases, intelligence becomes the servant of domination. A highly developed mind can build extraordinary arguments explaining why control is necessary, why hierarchy is inevitable, why compassion is naive, or why power belongs only to those willing to seize it. The reasoning may appear flawless because it is internally consistent. Yet consistency alone does not prove coherence. A perfectly designed prison remains a prison even if every wall aligns with mathematical precision. Something equally important begins happening in relationships. Other people slowly stop being experienced as centers of consciousness equal to yourself. Instead, they become variables to manage, resources to organize, obstacles to remove, or assets to acquire. You may still speak kindly, you may still appear generous, but beneath the interaction, another calculation quietly unfolds. Every encounter becomes evaluated according to usefulness before humanity. That calculation rarely announces itself directly. It hides beneath ordinary questions. What can this person do for me? How much influence do they have? Will agreeing with them increase or decrease my position? Even affection can become transactional without the individual realizing it. Love slowly transforms into ownership because anything deeply valued begins feeling too dangerous to exist outside personal control. This is one reason genuine sovereignty appears so unfamiliar. Sovereignty does not need to reduce another person's freedom in order to experience its own. It is capable of remaining stable while allowing others to remain fully themselves. Control struggles to understand this because it assumes freedom eventually produces chaos. Sovereignty understands something different. It recognizes that coherence emerging freely possesses a strength that forced obedience can never create. Look carefully throughout history and you can see these two patterns repeatedly crossing paths. One builds systems that require increasing surveillance because trust continually decreases. The other builds relationships that require less surveillance because trust continually increases. One survives through compression. The other survives through expansion. Both create order, but the quality of that order could not be more different. This distinction also exists inside every individual. There are moments when you tighten your grip on life because uncertainty feels unbearable. There are other moments when you become deeply present without needing to dominate the outcome. Both possibilities already exist within human consciousness. The question is not whether one has ever appeared. The question is which one is quietly becoming your default orientation. Perhaps this is why identifying this pattern in others is far easier than recognizing it within ourselves. We notice controlling governments while overlooking our need to control conversations. We recognize manipulation in corporations while ignoring the subtle ways we manipulate people we love. We condemn domination on a global scale while practicing miniature versions of it inside ordinary moments. Consciousness often hides most effectively beneath behaviors we have already justified. That is why this teaching is not asking you to fear an archetype or search the world for enemies wearing a particular face. It is asking something much more demanding. It is asking whether there are places within your own awareness where security has quietly become more sacred than truth, where certainty has become more important than understanding, and where control has become easier than presence. Once those questions begin living honestly inside a person, an entirely different landscape starts revealing itself, and with it, a deeper architecture that has been quietly shaping human civilization all along. Every civilization eventually reveals what it trusts most, not through its words, but through the systems it continues building. A culture that fundamentally trusts consciousness invests in education, dialogue, creativity, and the slow development of wisdom. A culture that fundamentally trusts control invests in surveillance, enforcement, hierarchy, and increasingly sophisticated methods of prediction. Neither civilization announces its assumptions directly. Their architecture speaks long before their philosophy does. This is why buildings, institutions, economies, and technologies should never be viewed as neutral objects. They are frozen expressions of invisible priorities. Every design quietly answers the same question. What does this civilization believe human beings are? If people are believed to be inherently dangerous, systems will be designed to contain them. If people are believed capable of coherence, systems will increasingly support responsibility rather than replace it. Long before a society declares its values, it has already embodied them. Notice how easily control justifies its own expansion. Every new mechanism promises that it will finally solve the instability created by the previous mechanism. More oversight is proposed because trust has declined. More rules appear because freedom produced outcomes that felt uncomfortable. More centralized authority becomes necessary because distributed responsibility appears unpredictable. Yet every layer added to preserve order often produces the very conditions requiring another layer of control. Eventually, an invisible exchange occurs. Security is purchased with agency. Convenience is purchased with discernment. Predictability is purchased with vitality. Most people do not experience this as oppression because nothing seems violently removed. Instead, countless small decisions slowly relocate responsibility from the individual into external systems until dependence begins feeling natural. This pattern exists just as clearly inside a single human life. There are people who cannot tolerate silence because silence cannot be managed. Others cannot tolerate disagreement because disagreement cannot be fully predicted. Some constantly schedule every hour because open space feels threatening rather than alive. The calendar itself is not the issue. The question is whether structure serves awareness or whether awareness has become a servant of structure. The difference can only be felt from within. Two people may perform exactly the same action while operating from entirely different consciousness. One creates order because clarity naturally expresses itself through organization. The other creates order because disorder awakens panic. Outwardly, the behavior appears identical. Inwardly, the experience could not be more different. This explains why this consciousness is so difficult to recognize through appearances alone. It does not belong exclusively to governments, corporations, military structures, or ancient myths. It can quietly appear inside spiritual communities, families, classrooms, friendships, and even sincere attempts to help others. Whenever certainty becomes more important than understanding, the architecture has already begun assembling itself. Perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the relationship to knowledge itself. Knowledge can become a doorway into humility because every discovery reveals how much remains unseen. Or knowledge can become another instrument of dominance. Facts become weapons. Insight becomes status. Understanding becomes something accumulated to stand above others instead of something lived more deeply within oneself. The information may be accurate while the consciousness expressing it has quietly become distorted. This is why genuine wisdom almost always carries an unusual softness, not weakness, not indecision. Softness born from recognizing that reality consistently exceeds the limits of personal certainty. Such a mind remains capable of conviction without becoming imprisoned by conclusions. It can change because identity is rooted in truth rather than in being right. The controlling mind experiences this flexibility as dangerous. If certainty relaxes, it imagines everything collapsing into chaos. It mistakes openness for surrender because it cannot yet distinguish between awareness and passivity. Yet awareness does not become weaker by remaining open. It becomes more accurate because reality is continually allowed to correct perception rather than being forced to confirm it. This begins revealing another hidden mechanism. Control does not merely seek obedience from others. It also seeks obedience from reality itself. It wants life to unfold according to expectation. It wants people to remain predictable. It wants the future to justify the plans made in the past. Whenever reality refuses these demands, frustration emerges, not simply because events changed, but because existence itself declined to submit. That frustration slowly accumulates into exhaustion. Maintaining control requires constant vigilance because life refuses to stop moving. Relationships evolve. Cultures transform. Children mature. New ideas appear. Circumstances shift beyond prediction. The controlling mind experiences every movement as another problem requiring management, while awareness experiences movement as the ordinary rhythm of a living universe. For this reason, the opposite of this consciousness is not disorder. Many imagine that releasing control means abandoning responsibility, standards, or discernment. The opposite is actually participation. Instead of standing over life attempting to dominate it, one begins standing within life, learning how to move with its deeper patterns rather than against them. Strength remains, but its expression changes from force into coherence. Coherence possesses a remarkable quality that domination cannot imitate. It influences without demanding. It stabilizes without constricting. It invites trust because nothing inside it needs to manipulate agreement. People often leave such a presence feeling more themselves rather than more dependent upon the one who influenced them. That is a profoundly different form of power. Perhaps this is why the deepest expressions of sovereignty rarely appear dramatic. They are found in the person who can hear criticism without collapsing into defense, in the leader who does not require constant admiration to remain steady, in the parent who prepares a child for independence instead of permanent dependence, in the teacher who celebrates students eventually exceeding the teacher. None of these examples abandon structure. They simply refuse to confuse guidance with possession. Seen from this perspective, the reptilian or Draco pattern is less a species to identify than a recurring possibility within consciousness whenever fear hardens into architecture and architecture begins demanding allegiance from everything around it. Once you recognize that possibility within yourself, within relationships, within institutions, and within history, another question naturally begins to emerge. If this architecture can quietly reproduce itself across every scale of human experience, then what kind of consciousness is capable of dissolving it without becoming its opposite? What dissolves the architecture is not another architecture built in opposition to it. History has repeatedly demonstrated that domination can disguise itself as liberation whenever it inherits the same relationship to power. One empire collapses while another emerges carrying a different language, but preserving the identical structure beneath it. The symbols change, the uniforms change, the promises change. Yet consciousness continues operating through the same assumption that reality must ultimately be controlled rather than understood. This is why reaction alone never creates freedom. Whatever defines itself entirely against something remains quietly organized by the very thing it opposes. A person consumed by resisting control often discovers that control has simply changed direction. Instead of dominating others, they become dominated by opposition itself. Their attention remains captured. Their emotional landscape remains dependent upon the existence of an enemy. Their consciousness has not become sovereign. It has merely changed its point of attachment. Sovereignty begins somewhere far less dramatic. It begins the moment awareness notices its own impulse before automatically obeying it. Fear may still arise. Anger may still appear. The desire to control another person may briefly enter awareness. Yet something new has emerged between the impulse and the action. That space is small enough to overlook, but entire civilizations become possible or impossible depending upon whether human beings learn to inhabit it. Within that space, perception changes before behavior changes. Instead of asking, how do I make this situation obey me? Awareness begins asking, what is actually happening here? Those questions appear similar because both seek understanding, yet they arise from entirely different relationships with reality. One approaches life as an object to command. The other approaches life as something capable of revealing itself. This difference transforms conflict in ways that are rarely appreciated. The controlling mind enters disagreement already carrying a conclusion that must survive. Every sentence becomes another opportunity to defend identity. Listening becomes strategic rather than sincere because information is evaluated according to whether it strengthens or weakens an existing position. Conversation quietly disappears while negotiation between competing certainties takes its place. Awareness approaches the same disagreement differently. It remains capable of holding conviction without requiring that conviction remain untouched. It listens because reality may be larger than its present understanding. It speaks because truth deserves expression, not because identity requires victory. There is strength within such a posture, but it is the strength of stability rather than force. Nothing essential is threatened by learning. Notice how this changes the experience of power itself. Within the architecture of domination, power is finite. If another person gains influence, something has been taken from you. If another voice is heard, your own becomes less significant. Scarcity governs every relationship because identity depends upon relative position. Existence becomes an endless competition for psychological territory. Coherent consciousness does not experience power this way. It recognizes that wisdom shared does not diminish wisdom possessed. Another person's freedom does not reduce your own capacity for freedom. Another person's growth is not evidence of your decline. Reality ceases feeling like a battlefield of limited significance and begins resembling a living ecology where coherence in one part strengthens the whole. Competition still exists where appropriate, but it no longer defines existence. This explains why genuine leaders consistently produce more leaders rather than more followers. Domination requires dependency because dependency validates authority. Sovereignty seeks maturity because maturity expands coherence. The controlling teacher fears the gifted student eventually leaving. The sovereign teacher quietly prepares for that day from the beginning. Success is measured not by perpetual influence, but by the emergence of independent wisdom. Perhaps this reveals the deepest misunderstanding surrounding the reptilian or Draco pattern. It is often imagined as intelligence without emotion, strategy without compassion, calculation without love. Yet the deeper issue is not the absence of feeling. It is the narrowing of consciousness until survival becomes the organizing principle through which every other human capacity is interpreted. Even compassion becomes strategic. Even generosity becomes transactional. Even beauty becomes valuable only if it strengthens position. When survival becomes the highest value, every other value eventually serves it. Truth becomes useful only when advantageous. Relationships become meaningful only when beneficial. Knowledge becomes important only when empowering. Beauty becomes appreciated only when possessed. This is not because these things lack inherent worth, but because consciousness has reduced every dimension of existence into a single organizing principle. The world has become smaller without realizing that anything has been lost. The opposite movement is not toward naivety, but toward integration. Survival remains important, but it no longer sits upon the throne of awareness. Strength remains necessary, yet it serves wisdom rather than replacing it. Boundaries continue to exist, though they emerge from clarity instead of fear. Authority continues to function, but its legitimacy grows from coherence rather than intimidation. Nothing essential disappears, everything simply returns to its proper relationship. Seen from this perspective, the question is never whether humanity will eliminate this pattern entirely. Every generation, every culture, every institution, and every individual will encounter the temptation to exchange the uncertainty of awareness for the apparent security of control. The invitation is not to imagine a world where this possibility vanishes forever. The invitation is to recognize it more quickly each time it begins quietly assembling itself within perception. That recognition becomes one of the most practical forms of freedom available to a human being. You begin noticing the subtle contraction before it hardens into certainty. You recognize when fear starts writing philosophies instead of simply passing through experience. You become aware of the moment another person stops appearing as a living consciousness and starts appearing as a problem to solve or an asset to acquire. These moments are ordinary, but they determine the quality of an entire life. Perhaps that is why these tones are best understood as mirrors rather than identities. They are not asking you to decide which civilization you belong to or which mythology you believe. They are asking you to observe the living movements of consciousness that repeatedly express themselves through individuals, families, institutions, nations, and civilizations across time. Once you begin recognizing those movements without immediately condemning or defending them, perception itself becomes quieter, more spacious, and more honest. From that quieter place, another possibility begins to emerge. You no longer need to defeat every pattern in order to understand it. You no longer need to fear every architecture in order to avoid becoming imprisoned by it. Awareness itself gradually becomes the environment in which distortion loses its ability to organize experience without permission. And as that awareness continues deepening, other tones within the spiral begin revealing themselves, not as competing voices, but as additional dimensions of consciousness waiting to be recognized within the same human journey.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.